So as we move into the message part of our online worship, last week I was noting how extraordinary and difficult these circumstances are. And one element that's a challenge for me as a preacher is to preach to an empty room without the give and take of the community and your dear faces. So I wanted to share with you as we came in to do the recording today, our other staff, we were greeted with a surprise. And so I'm going to turn this camera around so you can see that they took the pictures from our new photo directory and taped you all into the pews. And so when I preach, I'll be looking at least at photos of your faces. You see our musicians in their appropriate places. There's Diane even up there in the organ loft. And so that was a delightful surprise. And we're thankful for all the gifts that are coming in this time, and for that one in particular. And so I wanted to share that with you. So that's when I'm not looking into the camera. I'm looking at your faces taped there. And some of you who are the amen people and you answer my questions, you can't do that. But I love getting to see this representation of the community. So in this crazy Lenten season like none any of us have known in our own lifetimes, we've been talking about the reign of God because that's what Jesus primarily talked about. Even if some of us grew up in churches or spent our lives in churches and didn't hear much about that, it's the primary focus of his teaching, his ministry. And so we've been engaging a series throughout this season around the reign of God. And Jesus says, as he announces it in the start of the Gospels, he says, the reign of God is at hand, available, accessible, right here. You heard, though, in the Gospel of Luke, there are some religious leaders who have for him a pretty reasonable question. So Jesus, you say the reign of God is accessible right here. Well, where is it? We're having a hard time seeing it. And perhaps as you hear language of the reign of God is at hand, we might have the same kind of question, a reasonable question. Where is it, Jesus? Where's this reign of God? Because what's easy to see are empty store shelves and overly full ICU beds. We see chaotic and conflicting messages. We have tussling at the highest levels of government. We can feel rudderless and afraid. Where is this reign of God? So Jesus does not shame them for the question. He knows where such questions come from. He understands. And so he speaks to them. Because what's likely going on for them is they have a picture of what the reign of God should look like. And they're not seeing that. And what was likely typical in that time and place is that folks expected that the reign of God would look like other reigns, other kingdoms, other rulers, where there would be great armies and lots of money and power and all the normal kinds of things that God's reign should look like that. So an expectation, for example, some people had is that there would be this great host of the heavens, an angel army that would descend from the heavens and get rid of the oppressive Roman Empire. Or the more practical-minded, maybe imagined a human army being raised up, but God-led and God-protected, that would get rid of the Romans, a quick fix. And then Israel could be the great nation. And Israel could be in charge in terms of politics and money. So it's likely they had that kind of picture or expectation. So Jesus, he's letting them know that the reign of God isn't about the usual armies and power and money thrown at things. It's not the quick fix. It's not something magic in the sky. And it's not the something out there that will take care of all the problems for you. Jesus says, as you heard, says the reign of God is within you, among you, here, in your relationships, in your connections, in your heart, in your body, in your spirit. So we've been talking about this reign throughout the Lenten season and different pictures that help us understand, well, what's he saying is in here? What's that look like? What's it lived like? What's it feel like? And we talked about the creation story that gives us the DNA, the imprint of what God might have had in mind from the beginning, where there's the chaos of the deep and the churning storminess and the emptiness, and God speaks into the emptiness. God's Spirit moves over the deep and separates the waters from the waters and creates out of the chaos life, bright, beautiful, all creatures great and small. And human beings in the image of God, stewards of that creation with great power over the rest of it. And the idea, the picture is humans in covenant with God and with the creation, all of it living together. God says, ooh, that's very good. But we've also talked about the stories that teach us and remind us that God does not reign as tyrant. God is not coercive or a dictator. That God lets us choose to be in on the reign of God or not. And that often we humans choose not. We try to go it alone. We try to do it ourselves. And so we then disconnect from the power that creates in the chaos, the light that fills the darkness. And so disconnected from that wisdom and that power, well, what happens is, individually or collectively, from everything from our relationships and our community structures, institutions, governments, well, things start to come undone. That without God's Spirit and power and wisdom, things unravel. And there's a story that talks about the chaos flooding back in. So when we're in the storms, when we're in the chaos, and we're knowing what that feels like, perhaps in unique and for some of us overwhelming ways right now. One of the tendencies, and we see it in the stories, is to try to manage the chaos. Fight it, flee it. But we see reminders in the stories how chaos management does not convert the chaos into creation, but just pushes off the storms and the waves often onto others. Again, whether we're doing that individually or collectively. And Israel tells a story about how a nation can push off the chaos onto other people, and it squeezes and squishes. Mitzrayim, we talked about last week. The word for Egypt that means narrow place, squished place. So when we try to just fight or flee the chaos, we just end up shoving it usually onto the most vulnerable people. And we're seeing that happening in our own world and in our own culture right now. And so that is not God's desire either. And so there's a call to a different way, and we see it in some of the stories, where instead of fighting the waves or fleeing them and pushing them around, which, by the way, karmically speaking, what goes around comes around, those waves end up overwhelming us eventually. We see stories of people, instead of fighting and fleeing, instead of trying to manage the chaos, folks who keep listening for God, and Noah, for example, walking with God. So stories of buoyancy in the chaos, and new starts and new life. Stories of the Israelites on the shore of the Red Sea wanting to fight or flee, and how they're told to be still and move with God. And then there's a recreation story of the waters separating from the waters, just like in Genesis 1, and moving forward into new hope and new possibilities. We see stories in the parables and from the prophets, images of a stump, which looks like hopelessness and lifelessness, but a green shoot coming from the stump. Parables where Jesus talks about mustard seeds and yeast and wedding banquets. Ideas of the reign of God where it can seem insignificant and small, but if just someone or a remnant of people will pay attention and move with God, there is hope for new life, for healing, for new creation. And those images and ideas are helpful and hopeful. But one of the things we might then have in our minds, vision helps, but well, what's it look like when it gets lived out in human community? And so today we focus on the idea, the image, the story that tells us that it's not God just giving visions or images, but that the reign of God is made flesh, that the reign of God gets embodied. And we tell the story of a man named Jesus who shows us what the embodied reign of God looks like. In the Gospel of John story that you heard, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The idea of this word, one way to interpret or understand it, is to say that's the reign of God. So if you went through the Gospel of John chapter 1 and took every time it says word and put reign, R-E-I-G-N, it'll make sense. It's how is God's power, love, justice, mercy reigning. And that in the beginning was the reign of God, and it was with God, and it is God, because you can't separate God's reign from God. And as it continues, there's this image and idea that John's trying to describe, saying, and we saw that reign of God that's been from the beginning, we saw it embodied in a person, named Jesus. And sometimes people have rejected that reign. It says his own people did not accept him, some of them, and we'll talk more about that next week. But also we hear that when people see and trust that reign of God, that they are empowered to live as the beloved children of God that they are. And so that's what the story's wanting to tell us about Jesus. When he says the reign of God is within you and among you, it's not just an idea. It's something that he's living, and he's teaching other people how to live it. That for Jesus, too, it's important to recognize, because we were taught kind of different things and theologies about Jesus, but what we see in the actual Gospels is that Jesus doesn't embody the reign of God just somehow magically or automatically. He, like those who came before, from Noah to Moses to Miriam, these are people who chose to embody the reign of God. And Jesus chooses it. He listens for how God is still speaking. He waits on God, like we heard the Israelites do at the Red Sea. He moves with God. He lets God's Spirit be at work in him, so that that reign of God is then lived by him. So he then can live with great generosity and healing and hope and love and connect people and welcome the outsider and love the stranger and love the enemy, because he chooses to let God's Spirit and life reign in him and then be alive through him. And Jesus does not do all of that so that we'll say, isn't he impressive? Or so that we would worship Jesus. Jesus doesn't say, worship me. Jesus says, some of you know, follow me. That he embodies, he makes flesh the reign of God to teach us how to do it too. He calls people to follow in his way, to listen for the still speaking voice of God, to make room and space for practices of silence and stillness, for celebration and conversation and community with the scriptures, with other people, worship, all these practices that help other people experience God's wisdom and love and power at work in us. And so the reign of God, not out there, not some magic thing, but something alive in us that we can live too. So a lot of people have talked about what's like this current situation. And I got nothing. I mean, nothing in my experience or anyone I've talked to really approaches the strangeness and the deep challenges that are likely long-lasting of our situation. But one that does emerge that's sort of like it, or that reminds us, is September 11th. And I was a new pastor in a particular church. I'd been there 3 weeks when September 11th happened, and I remember it well. And I remember all the fear and the what will happen and what's next and how long will this go on and when can it be safe to gather in big crowds again. And what was different is after September 11th, we still could hold each other. We still could hang out with our neighbors and friends in person. And so this in ways is even harder. But I'm remembering after September 11th, there were 2 members of my congregation at the time who had attended a gospel music workshop at an African-American church. And the folks from my church were of European extraction. And in that gospel music workshop, they were noticing how in their diversity of beliefs and backgrounds and race, there had been something uniting about spirit and song. And they started talking with each other. And there were lots of conversations, but what was born from that was something that ended up being called the Community Connects Choir. And the idea of this was in the sense of division and fear after that great tragedy of September 11, 2001, a desire to bring the community together, to look at what can unite us and hold us. And so it was a 150-voice choir. They rehearsed in my congregation sanctuary because we're the big downtown church and we had room. And I sang with them. And we had people from really every racial and religious and even non-religious background in our community were coming together. And there was this great equalizer. We had 2 directors. One, an African-American gospel choir director who primarily taught people the songs by singing you your part and you would sing them back. And then we had this conductor who worked with one of our suburban high schools and also a fine arts camp who did mostly sacred choral music with the sheet music that people in my churches are used to. So if you were a sheet music reader, you had some music that you were comfortable with, and then the whole other kinds of music that you were having to learn by hearing, way out of your comfort zone. And if you were used to having music sung to you, and now you had notes, way out of your comfort zone, and watching everyone work together to help each other learn that music. And we had a performance, a concert, that was scheduled just a bit before Christmas. And it was in the largest music venue in our city. And it was packed. And we were backstage waiting to go on. And we could hear the buzz and the sense of we're going to take what we've been experiencing together and now share it with this wider community. And there was a Lutheran pastor of Germanic background who said, as we're waiting in line to go on, he says, "Well, ain't this something?" And next to him was a woman, African American, from a Pentecostal church, and she said, "Oh, it sure is. And I'll go further. What we got going on here is some kingdom come." This is kingdom come. We pray for it every week. We're making it happen. It's right here with us. It's right here among us. And I share that story with you because we can't yet envision what's possible in this, on the other side of it. But I trust that as we follow in that way of Jesus, as we let the reign of God be lived in us and among us, even as we're socially distanced at this moment, there will be possibilities for new life, for hope, for healing, for love, for all that is very good. Jesus shows us the way. Come and see. Amen.